"So, you finally learned your lesson." My father's voice cut through the quiet of the funeral like a knife-sharp cold, and still carrying that same old edge I remembered from 17 years ago. It wasn't a question. It was a verdict. A summary of my entire existence delivered in a single glacial sentence at the one place, the one moment, where I deserved nothing but peace. I turned slowly, the smell of fresh cut flowers and polished wood heavy in the air, suffocating me with the scent of closure and grief. The church looked smaller than I remembered, the ceilings lower, the pews narrower, or maybe I had just grown. Maybe the world had shrunk around the gravity of what was happening. He stood there in his dark suit, shoulders a little more bent than before, hair thinner, grayer, but his expression, that hadn't changed much. That same tight jaw, that same look of disapproval that used to make me feel about 2 inches tall, that look that had haunted my nightmares for nearly 2 decades. I felt Daniel's hand lightly rest against my back, steady, grounding, a silent reminder that I was no longer that scared 15-year-old girl. I took a breath long and slow, letting it fill my lungs before I spoke. "Yeah," I said quietly, my voice steady. "Then meet my husband." Daniel stepped forward, not aggressive, not defensive, just present, solid, the kind of man my father never knew how to be. He offered his hand, a gesture of basic human decency, and for the first time in my life, my father didn't have a word to say. He just stood there frozen, his eyes darting from Daniel to me, and then to the young woman standing beside me, his granddaughter, a person he had never even known existed. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard. If you have ever stood in front of someone who tore your life apart and felt the weight of every year, every struggle, and every small victory pressing against your chest, then you know exactly what this moment felt like. It wasn't just anger. It was the closing of a circle that had been open and bleeding for 17 years. This story isn't just about a fight or a reunion. It's about the long, hard road of survival and the undeniable, crushing weight of a life lived well in the face of those who wanted to see you fail. If you've ever dreamed of serving justice to someone who wronged you, hit that like button, subscribe, and get ready for one of the most satisfying revenge stories you will ever hear, because this isn't about screaming or fighting. It's about the kind of silence that ruins a man. 17 years earlier, I had been 15 years old and terrified out of my mind. I remember the day like it was burned into me with a branding iron. It was late October, cool air leaves crunching underfoot, that faint smell of wood smoke drifting through the neighborhood, the kind of day that should have felt peaceful, the kind of day that makes you want to wrap your hands around a warm mug of cider and watch the world slow down. But nothing about me felt peaceful. My insides were a storm, a swirling mess of panic and nausea that never quite settled. I had been sitting on the edge of my bed, staring at that little plastic stick in my hand like it was going to change its mind if I waited long enough, like the 2 pink lines might fade if I just blinked hard enough. 2 pink lines. I didn't understand how something so small could carry so much weight. It was a stick of plastic, no bigger than a pen, yet it felt heavier than the entire house I was sitting in. I kept thinking, this can't be right. I was a good student. I did my homework. I helped my mom with groceries. I wasn't one of those girls people whispered about in the hallway. I had a plan. I had a future. I was going to be someone. But reality doesn't care about the stories we tell ourselves. Reality is cold and indifferent. I was pregnant, and I had no idea what to do. His name was Jason Miller. He sat behind me in English class. Quiet most days, but when he talked, he had a way of making you feel like you were the only person in the room. He had these dark eyes that seemed to listen, really listen, when you spoke. Back then, that meant everything. We weren't reckless in the way people imagined. There wasn't some wild rebellion, no partying, no drinking, just 2 kids who didn't fully understand consequences, 2 kids who thought love was enough to shield them from the world. And when I told him, the color drained from his face like I had just told him the world was ending. He went pale, said he needed time to think. Then he stopped answering my calls. By the next week, he had transferred schools. Just like that, gone. Vanished as if he had never existed in my life at all. For 3 days, I carried that secret alone. I went to school. I smiled when people talked to me. I sat at the dinner table like everything was normal, cutting my food, chewing, swallowing, all while screaming inside my own head. My mom would ask, "How was your day, Em?" And I'd say, "Fine." But nothing was fine. The word felt like sand in my mouth. By the fourth day, I couldn't hold it in anymore. The secret was eating me alive, a corrosive acid in my stomach. That evening, my father was home early. He worked long shifts at the factory, always tired, always carrying that weight of responsibility like it was armor he wore to protect himself from the world. We sat down to dinner, me, my mom, and him. Meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green beans. Normal. Too normal. The ordinariness of it made the upcoming storm feel even more terrifying. My hands were shaking so badly I had to keep them under the table, gripping my thighs until my knuckles turned white. "I need to tell you something," I said, my voice barely a whisper. My mother looked up first. She always did. Soft eyes, gentle concern, the kind of woman who felt everything deeply. "What is it, honey?" My father didn't look up right away. He just kept cutting his food, the knife scraping against the ceramic plate, a sound that set my teeth on edge. I swallowed hard, forcing the words past the lump in my throat. "I'm pregnant." The room went still. Not quiet, still like the air itself had stopped moving, like gravity had momentarily suspended itself. My mother's fork slipped from her hand and hit the plate with a small, sharp sound that echoed like a gunshot in the silence. My father froze mid-motion. Then slowly he looked up. I had never seen his face like that before. It wasn't just anger. It was something deeper, uglier, disappointment, disgust. "Say that again," he said. His voice was low, controlled, dangerous. "I'm pregnant." My mother whispered my name, Emily, but my father pushed his chair back hard enough that it scraped across the floor with a screech that made me flinch. "Who?" he demanded. I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. My throat was closed tight. "Who?" he shouted, his voice cracking the air. "Jason," I said finally. "Jason Miller." He let out a bitter laugh, a sound void of humor. Of course, my mother stood up, her hands shaking. "Richard, please." "No," he snapped. "No, we're not doing this quietly." He turned back to me, his eyes burning. "You think this is some kind of mistake we can just fix," he said. "You've ruined your life. Do you understand that? You have thrown everything away." Tears blurred my vision, hot and fast. "I didn't mean." "You didn't mean." His voice rose, cutting me off. "You didn't mean to get pregnant. That's your excuse." "I'm scared," I said, my voice breaking, shattering into a million pieces. And for a split second, I thought I saw something flicker in his eyes, maybe pity, maybe hesitation. But it disappeared just as quickly, swallowed by his pride. "You're not staying here," he said. The words didn't register at first. They sounded like a foreign language. "What?" My mother said, her voice trembling. "You heard me," he said. "She made her choice. She can live with it." "Richard, she's 15, my mother cried, tears streaming down her face. "And she's about to be a mother," he shot back. "Old enough for that. She's old enough to figure it out." I felt like the ground had dropped out from under me. I was falling into a bottomless pit. "Dad, please," I whispered. He didn't even look at me. He looked right through me as if I were already gone. "I won't have this under my roof," he said. "I won't have people talking about this family like we raised." "Like we raised what?" My mother snapped, surprising both of us with her sudden ferocity. He stopped. For a moment, the room shifted. The mask slipped. But then his expression hardened again, turning to stone. "This is final," he said. "I packed that night. Not much, just what I could carry in one small duffel bag." My mother stood in the doorway, crying quietly, her heart breaking in real time. She kept trying to hand me things, extra clothes, some money, a blanket. "I'll talk to him," she kept saying. "This isn't over." But we both knew it was. We both knew that when Richard made a decision, it was written in stone. Before I left, she pulled me into a tight hug, holding me like she was trying to press her love into my bones. "I love you," she whispered. "No matter what happens." I clung to her like I was drowning because I was. "I love you too, Mom." My father didn't come out to say goodbye, didn't say anything at all. He didn't even look at the door. The last image I have of him from that night is his silhouette sitting at the kitchen table, back turned, staring at nothing, a statue of indifference. When I stepped outside, the air was cold enough to sting. The street was quiet. No cars, no voices, just the sound of leaves shifting in the wind. I stood there for a long moment holding that bag, feeling the weight of everything I had just lost. My home, my family, my future, at least the one I thought I was supposed to have. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't have a plan. All I knew was that I couldn't go back. So I started walking one step at a time into a life I wasn't ready for, but one I would have to survive. I spent my first night out of my father's house on the pull-out sofa in my friend Carla Benson's basement. Carla and I had known each other since second grade. We'd traded stickers on the playground, passed notes in middle school, and spent long summer afternoons drinking Kool-Aid on her back porch. Her family wasn't rich, but they were kind. And that first night, kindness felt like the only solid thing left in the world. Her mother met me at the door in a bathrobe, took one look at my face, and didn't ask questions right away. She just said, "Come in, honey, you're freezing." I remember that because nobody had called me honey since I walked out of my own front door. Carla helped me carry my duffel bag downstairs. The basement smelled faintly of laundry detergent and damp concrete. There was a floral sheet folded over the sofa and an old lamp in the corner with a shade that leaned a little crooked. "It's not much," Carla said softly. "It's everything right now," I told her. That was the truth. I slept maybe 2 hours that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my father's face. Every time I opened them, I had to remind myself where I was. The baby inside me was still just an idea, then a secret turned catastrophe, but already it felt like my whole life had split in two before and after. The next morning, Carla's mother set a plate of scrambled eggs in front of me and finally asked, "Do your folks know where you are?" I nodded. "Are they coming for you?" I looked down at the table, unable to meet her eyes. "No, ma'am." She was quiet for a moment. Then she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Well," she said, "you can stay a few days while you figure things out." A few days. At 15, a few days felt like the whole future. It felt like an eternity and a millisecond all at once. For a week, I stayed there and tried to think. I still went to school, though I moved through the hallways like a ghost. Word hadn't spread yet, but I could feel it coming. In a small town, secrets didn't stay buried. They just waited for the right pair of ears, the right gossip session. At lunch, I sat with Carla and picked at my food. "You could talk to the guidance counselor," she suggested. "And say what?" I asked. "Hi, I'm the town disgrace. Do you have a brochure for that?" She frowned. "Don't say that." But that's what everybody's going to think. Carla reached across the cafeteria table and put her hand over mine. Not everybody. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But I had grown up in that town. I knew how people talked. I knew how church ladies smiled to your face and whispered in the parking lot. I knew that once you were labeled, the label stuck. By the second week, I started getting sick in the mornings. Carla's mother heard me throwing up and knocked gently on the bathroom door. "You need a doctor," she said. I told her I didn't have any money. She said, "Then we'll figure it out." That was how I ended up at the county health clinic on the edge of town, sitting in a hard plastic chair under fluorescent lights that made everyone look tired. A nurse with tired eyes and a gentle voice confirmed what I already knew and asked me questions I was barely old enough to understand. How far along? Did I have support? Was the father involved? I answered as best I could. When she asked if I had a safe place to live, I hesitated. That hesitation said more than my words ever could. Her name was Lorraine Jenkins. She had silver hair pinned up neatly and the practical shoes of a woman who had spent years on her feet taking care of other people. She wasn't much for sugarcoating, but her voice had warmth in it. After the appointment, she pulled up a chair beside me. "You're carrying too much for a girl your age," she said. That was the first time I cried in front of a stranger. I cried so hard I could barely breathe. All the fear and humiliation and loneliness came pouring out of me in that ugly, gasping way that leaves you embarrassed afterward. Mrs. Jenkins didn't hush me. She didn't tell me to calm down. She just let me cry, let the storm pass. When I finally stopped, she handed me a tissue and said, "All right, now we deal with what's in front of us." She knew a church outreach program that could help with a short-term place to stay. But when that fell through, she did something I still think was one of the bravest kindnesses anyone has ever shown me. She invited me into her home. "I've got a spare room," she said. "Nothing fancy, and I make no promises about my cooking, but it's warm and it's safe." I stared at her. "Why would you do that?" She gave me a look over her glasses because once upon a time, someone did something kind for me when they didn't have to. That's how the world keeps going. Mrs. Jenkins lived in a little white house on Maple Street with 2 rocking chairs on the porch and a kitchen that always smelled faintly of coffee. There were framed black and white family photos on the walls and crocheted potholders hanging by the stove. It felt like stepping into a life that had weathered storms and kept standing. She made up the spare room with clean sheets and set a glass of water on the nightstand. "You can stay until you're steady," she told me. Not forever, not as a daughter, not as charity, just until I was steady. That mattered. It gave me dignity. I finished the semester, then dropped out before the spring term. I hated doing it. I had always liked school, but morning sickness turned into fatigue, and the whispers had started. Girls I had known for years avoided me in the hallway. A boy in algebra muttered something under his breath when I passed his desk. One teacher stopped meeting my eyes entirely. I told myself I'd go back someday. In the meantime, I needed money. Mrs. Jenkins helped me get a part-time job at a diner just off Highway 12. The owner, Frank Donnelly, was a thick-shouldered man with red cheeks and a habit of calling everybody kid, no matter their age. "You show up on time and work hard, you've got a job," he told me. That sounded fair enough. So I worked. I poured coffee for truckers before sunrise. I wiped down counters. I carried plates that felt heavier every week as my belly grew. My feet ached, my back hurt, and by the end of each shift, I smelled like grease and bacon and exhaustion. Still, every Friday, when Frank handed me my paycheck in a white envelope, I felt something small but important settle inside me. I was still standing. I wasn't asking anyone for permission. My mother called the Jenkins house twice that winter. The first time, Mrs. Jenkins answered and came to get me with a strange softness on her face. "It's your mother." I nearly dropped the dish towel in my hand. My mother's voice on the phone sounded far away, like it was traveling through more than just miles. "Emily," she whispered. "Mom," she cried quietly. I could hear her trying not to let anyone in the house notice. "Are you all right?" "No," I said honestly. Then, after a pause, "But I'm managing." She told me she was sorry. Over and over, she said she was sorry. She said she had tried to talk to my father, but every time she brought me up, he shut down like a steel door. "Does he ask about me?" I asked, though I hated myself for asking. She was quiet too long. "No," she said at last, not out loud. That hurt more than I expected. It was a confirmation of my erasure. By summer, I was too big to hide anything from anybody. But something had changed in me by then. I was still scared, Lord. I was scared every day, but fear had started making room for something else. Resolve. A cold, hard determination. When labor started, it came in the middle of the night with a pain so deep it felt like my whole body had been seized from the inside. Mrs. Jenkins drove me to County General in her old Buick, one hand on the wheel, the other reaching over every few minutes to pat my arm. "You breathe," she said. "I'll do the driving." It was 16 hours before my daughter came into the world. 16 hours of pain, sweat, panic, nurses coming and going, the smell of antiseptic and the harsh buzz of hospital lights. I remember gripping the rails of that bed and thinking I couldn't do it, then doing it anyway. When they finally laid her on my chest, everything else fell away. The pain, the fear, the father who rejected me, the boy who ran. It all dissolved in the face of this new reality. She was tiny and red-faced and furious at being born with a head full of dark hair and a cry that seemed much too strong for such a little body. I looked at her and felt terror unlike anything I had known before. Not because I didn't want her, but because I did so much. "What's her name?" the nurse asked. I swallowed and looked down at her. "Lily," I said. That night, after the room had gone quiet and Mrs. Jenkins had dozed off in the chair by the window, I held my daughter in the crook of my arm and studied her face. So small, so innocent. I touched one finger to her little fist and she wrapped her hand around it. And I made her a promise in the dark. "You will never wonder if you're wanted," I whispered. "Not one day in your life." That promise became the truest thing I ever said. It became my North Star. By the time Lily was 2, I had learned that survival had a rhythm to it. Not a graceful rhythm, not anything you'd mistake for peace. More like a steady, stubborn beat you kept marching to because the alternative was falling apart. Wake up before dawn. Dress Lily while she was still sleepy enough not to fuss. Drop her with Mrs. Jenkins before my diner shift. Work until my feet throbbed. Pick Lily up. Stop at the grocery store with a list I recalculated 3 times in my head before walking in. Stretch ground beef into 2 meals. Wash uniforms in the sink when the laundromat had to wait. Put Lily to bed. Sit at the kitchen table with a pencil, a cup of instant coffee, and a knot of fear in my stomach while I figured out how to make next week work. That was my life. And for a long while, it was enough just to get through it. But there's something about being responsible for another human being that changes the way you look at tomorrow. I could live with being tired. I could live with being judged. I could even live with disappointment. What I could not live with was the idea that Lily's future would be as narrow as mine had suddenly become. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, Mrs. Jenkins found me at her kitchen table doing bills with tears in my eyes. "I'm short again," I said. Not by much, but enough. She sat down her cup of tea and sat across from me. Emily, what do you want? I laughed a little tired and sharp. Right now, about $50 extra. She smiled, but only for a second. No, I mean with your life. Nobody had asked me that in a long time. I looked down at the paper in front of me. I don't know, I used to. What did you used to know? I thought about that. About the girl I had been before everything broke open. I liked school, I said. Science, biology. I used to think maybe nursing. Something useful, something steady. Mrs. Jenkins leaned back in her chair as if she'd just heard something she had been waiting for. Well, she said that sounds a lot more like a plan than you think. It started with a GED. I studied at night after Lily went to sleep with flashcards and old prep books Mrs. Jenkins got from the library sale. Some evenings, my brain felt like mush by page 10. Some nights Lily woke up coughing or crying, and I had to rock her back to sleep before I could even think about algebra or grammar. But little by little, I chipped away at it. The day I passed, I sat in my car outside the testing center and cried so hard I had to wait 10 minutes before driving home. It was a small victory to the outside world, but to me, it was a mountain conquered. Mrs. Jenkins baked a cake from a box mix and wrote, "Proud of you," in crooked icing across the top. Lily, still small enough to need help holding her fork, clapped like I had won something grand. In a way, I had. After that came practical nursing classes at the community college one town over. I could only take a couple courses at a time, and I kept the diner job because rent and food didn't care about ambition. For a while, I lived in two worlds at once. In one, I was Emily the waitress who refilled coffee before you asked and kept ketchup bottles wiped clean. In the other, I was a student learning blood pressure, charting infection control, and how to keep my hands steady when somebody else's body was in pain. It was harder than anything I had ever done, but it also woke something back up in me. I wasn't just enduring anymore. I was building. I was fighting back against the narrative my father had written for me. By then, Lily was in grade school, all knees and curiosity. She loved books, tomato soup, and asking questions I didn't always know how to answer. One evening, while I was reviewing notes at the kitchen table, she climbed into the chair beside me and said, "Mama, are you doing homework too?" "I am," she grinned. Then we're both students. That made me smile for the rest of the night. The first time I met Daniel Brooks, I was 28 years old and halfway through a double shift at Meadow Ridge Care Center. He had come to visit his aunt, a woman named Evelyn, who had a stroke and never stopped correcting people's grammar. Daniel came every Thursday evening without fail, carrying a paperback in one hand and a paper sack in the other. Sometimes it was clean socks for Evelyn, sometimes lotion or hard candy she liked to keep hidden in the top drawer by her bed. He wasn't flashy, not even a little. He wore plain button-down shirts, sensible shoes, and a wristwatch that looked like it had been the same one for 20 years. He had a calm face, thoughtful eyes, and the kind of posture that made me think military before he ever told me. The first real conversation we had happened because his aunt buzzed me in to complain about the potatoes. Emily, Evelyn said, lowering her voice as if she were sharing state secrets, "These potatoes are an insult to Idaho." Daniel laughed from the corner chair. I tried not to but failed. "I'll pass that along to the kitchen," I said. "You do that," Evelyn said. Then she pointed at Daniel. "And this one needs to stop bringing me mystery novels where the killer is obvious by chapter 4. Daniel stood and offered me his hand. Daniel Brooks. Apparently, I fail both as a nephew and as a book selector. His handshake was warm and firm. "Emily Carter," I said, "and for what it's worth, the potatoes weren't my doing." "Well, that's a relief," he said. It was a simple exchange. Nothing dramatic. No music playing in the background. No lightning bolt from heaven, just a tired woman at the end of a long shift and a decent man making room for a laugh. At my age then, and with my history, that was more meaningful than sparks. Over the next few months, he became a familiar presence. He'd ask how my classes were going. I'd ask after Evelyn's mood, and he'd say, "Sharp as a tack and twice as dangerous." Sometimes, if my break lined up with his visit, we'd stand by the vending machines and talk for 10 minutes about ordinary things. Gas prices, weather, books, the way small towns change without admitting they've changed. Eventually, I learned he'd served as an Army medic in his 20s. Later, he became a paramedic, then moved into training after a back injury made the ambulance work too rough. He had been married once. His wife, Carol, had died of breast cancer 6 years earlier. He spoke of her with tenderness, not tragedy. That told me more about his character than anything else could have. One evening, he said, "Would you let me take you to dinner sometime?" I almost said no out of habit. Not because I didn't want to go, because wanting things had once cost me too much. He seemed to read that hesitation without offense. "If the answer's no, it's no," he said gently. "You won't hurt my feelings." I looked at him for a long moment, then I surprised myself. "Yes," I said, "I think I'd like that." Our first dinner was at a family restaurant with vinyl booths and a waitress who called everyone sweetheart. I spent half the meal waiting for him to become someone else, someone selfish, careless, demanding. Instead, he stayed exactly what he had seemed from the start, attentive without prying, steady, without being dull, kind, without making a show of it. When he walked me to my car, he didn't try to kiss me. He just said, "I had a good time, Emily." "So did I," he nodded as though that was enough, and stepped back. I sat in the driver's seat afterward with my hands on the wheel, feeling something old and frightened in me loosen just a little. Daniel met Lily 3 months later, over pancakes on a Saturday morning. I watched him closely, maybe too closely, waiting to see whether he'd perform kindness or simply live it. Lily spilled syrup on the table and burst into embarrassed tears. Daniel handed her an extra napkin and said, "Well, now the pancakes know they're loved." She laughed. That was the moment I let myself imagine the possibility that some men knew how to stay. By the time Daniel proposed years later, it wasn't with a grand speech or a fancy restaurant. It was in my kitchen after dinner while Lily was at a school concert. He stood there holding 2 mugs of coffee and said, "I love the life we already have. I'd like to keep building it with you if you'll let me." And because he was Daniel, because he knew me, he added, "You don't have to answer tonight." But the truth was, my answer had been growing quietly for a long time. Even so, when I looked at him, joy wasn't the only thing I felt. There was love. There was gratitude. And underneath it, still there was the old ache, the voice in the back of my mind that said, happiness could be taken from you, that families could turn cold, that security was sometimes just a door waiting to slam. I loved Daniel. I trusted him. But part of me still lived on that dark October road with a duffel bag in my hand. And no matter how much I rebuilt, some wounds did not heal just because life got better. I said yes to Daniel 2 days later, not because I needed more time to decide, but because I needed time to sit with the weight of it. Some decisions, especially the good ones, deserve to be entered into carefully. We got married in a small ceremony at the same church, where I would one day stand again for a very different reason. At the time, though, it felt like a quiet beginning. Mrs. Jenkins sat in the front row dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. Lily, now 12, stood beside me in a pale blue dress, holding my hand like she had when she was little. There were no grand gestures, no drama, just vows spoken clearly with intention. For the first time in my life, I felt something close to steady ground beneath me. The years that followed were not perfect, but they were good. And after everything I had been through, good felt like a kind of miracle. Daniel never tried to replace Lily's father. He didn't pretend to be something he wasn't. Instead, he showed up consistently, quietly in ways that mattered. He helped her with homework when I was on late shifts. He showed up at school events sitting in those hard bleachers with a thermos of coffee and a patience I admired. He taught her how to check the oil in a car, how to read a map, how to speak up when something didn't feel right. And Lily, she trusted him, not right away. That kind of trust doesn't grow overnight. But slowly she leaned toward him instead of away. One evening, when she was about 14, I overheard her telling a friend on the phone, "Yeah, my stepdad, he's a good man." I stood in the hallway listening, my hand pressed lightly against the wall, and felt something in my chest settle. That mattered more than I can explain. I finished my LPN certification not long after the wedding and transitioned from the diner to full-time work at Meadow Ridge. It wasn't glamorous, but it was meaningful. I cared for people who had lived long lives, people who had raised families, worked jobs, made mistakes, loved deeply, and carried regrets. They didn't always speak out loud. Some of them reminded me of what I had lost. Others reminded me of what I had built. There was a man named Mr. Halpern who liked to tell the same story every afternoon about the hardware store he ran for 30 years. A woman named Clara who kept a photograph of her late husband tucked inside her Bible and kissed it every night before bed. a retired school teacher who corrected my grammar in the sweetest possible way. Working there taught me something important. Time doesn't erase what we've done, but it can soften how we carry it. Despite everything I had gained, there was one part of my life that remained unfinished: my father. For years, I avoided thinking about him too directly. It was easier that way. I told myself I had moved on, that I didn't need anything from him. And in many ways, that was true. But pain doesn't disappear just because you stop looking at it. It waits. It settles into the quiet parts of your life: holidays, milestones, unexpected questions. Like the night Lily, around 16, sat at the kitchen table doing homework and said without looking up, "Mom, what was Grandpa like?" I froze. Daniel glanced at me, then quietly got up and stepped out of the room, giving me space. I sat down across from her. "He was strict," I said carefully. "Was he mean?" I hesitated. "No," I said slowly. "Not always, but he could be hard. And he didn't always know how to show love in a way that felt like love." She looked up then. "Did he love you?" That question sat heavy between us. I thought about it for a long time before answering. "I think he did," I said. "I just don't think he knew what to do with that love when things didn't go the way he expected." Lily nodded like she understood more than I wanted her to. "Do you ever talk to him?" she asked. "No. Do you want to?" That one was harder. I looked down at my hands. "I don't know," I said honestly. The truth was, I had tried, not in big dramatic ways, not with confrontations or demands, just quietly. Over the years, I had written letters. Not many, maybe 5 or 6. I never sent them. They stayed in a box at the back of my closet, folded carefully like pieces of a conversation that never found a voice. In those letters, I said things I didn't know how to say out loud. I told him about Lily, how she loved reading, how she had a stubborn streak that reminded me of him. I told him about school, about work, about the life I was building. I never accused him. I never begged. I just left the door open, but he never walked through it. My mother, though, she found ways, not openly, not in ways that would start a war in her home, but quietly. A birthday card would arrive with no return address, but I would recognize her handwriting immediately. Inside, there'd be a short message. "Thinking of you, I love you always." Sometimes there was a little cash tucked inside. Not much, just enough to say I'm still here. We spoke on the phone a handful of times over the years, always carefully. Always when my father wasn't around. "How are you really?" She would ask. "I'm okay," I'd say. And most of the time that was true. But there was always something unsaid between us. A space that should have been filled by family dinners, shared holidays, ordinary moments that never happened. Daniel knew about all of it. I told him early on, not every detail at once, but enough for him to understand the shape of my past. One evening, not long after we got engaged, we were sitting on the porch watching the sun go down. "Do you ever think about going back?" he asked gently. "To see him?" "Yes," I shook my head. "No," he didn't push. But after a moment, he said, "Sometimes closure isn't about them, it's about you." I understood what he meant. I just didn't know if I was ready to open that door. Years passed. Lily graduated high school, then college. Watching her walk across that stage, confident and smiling, I felt something close to peace. I had done it. Not perfectly, not easily. But I had kept my promise. She had never once wondered if she was wanted. Then one afternoon, everything shifted again. I was at work finishing a chart when the receptionist called me to the front desk. "There's a call for you," she said. "Says it's important." I picked up the phone, already feeling a strange heaviness in my chest. "Hello." There was a pause, then a voice I hadn't heard in years. "Emily," my breath caught. "Mom." Her voice sounded weaker, older, like time had finally caught up to her. "I'm glad I reached you," she said softly. Something in her tone made my heart start to race. "What's wrong?" I asked. There was a long silence. Then she said the words that changed everything. "I don't have much time." I don't remember the drive to my hometown. Not clearly. I remember Daniel packing a small bag without asking too many questions. I remember Lily calling from 2 states away, her voice tight with concern. I remember the way my hands trembled on my lap as Daniel drove steady and quiet beside me. But the road itself, that part is a blur. Somehow, after 17 years, I was going back. The town hadn't changed as much as I expected. Or maybe it had changed in all the ways that didn't matter. The gas station on the corner was still there, though the sign had been replaced. The old movie theater had closed its marquee, now blank and weathered. The grocery store, where my mother used to shop every Thursday, still stood, but the parking lot looked emptier. Time had moved on, just not loudly. As we drove down Maple Street, I felt something tighten in my chest. There, I said quietly. Daniel slowed the car. Mrs. Jenkins's old house sat exactly where it always had. The white paint was a little more worn, the porch chairs gone, but it was still standing. She saved me, I said more to myself than to him. Daniel reached over and squeezed my hand. I know. We went straight to the hospital. The smell hit me first. Antiseptic, clean, familiar in a way that made my chest ache. I had spent years working in places like this, but walking in as a daughter instead of a nurse felt entirely different. At the front desk, I gave my mother's name. The nurse checked the chart, then looked up at me with something gentle in her eyes. "She's been asking for you," she said. That nearly broke me. My mother looked smaller. That's the first thing I noticed when I walked into the room. Smaller, thinner, like the years had quietly taken pieces of her I hadn't realized were missing. But when she saw me, her face lit up. "Emily," she whispered. I crossed the room in 2 steps and took her hand. "I'm here, Mom." She held on to me like she was afraid I might disappear again. "I didn't know if you'd come," she said. "I would always come for you," I told her. And that was the truth. We talked for hours in that quiet hospital room. About small things at first, safe things. The weather, Lily, my job. Daniel stood quietly near the window, giving us space but never leaving. At one point, my mother reached out to him. "You must be Daniel," she said. "Yes, ma'am," she smiled faintly. "Thank you for taking care of my girl." His voice was steady. "She's taken care of all of us." That made her eyes fill with tears. Later, when the room had gone still and the light outside softened into evening, she looked at me differently, more seriously. "There are things I should have said a long time ago," she said. I shook my head gently. "You don't have to." "Yes, I do," she said, surprising me with a firmness I hadn't heard in years. I went quiet. She took a slow breath. "I should have fought harder for you." The words landed softly but deeply. "Mom." "No," she said. I let him make the decision. I told myself it would calm down, that he would come around, but I let you walk out that door alone. Tears slid down her cheeks. "I have carried that with me every day." I swallowed hard, my own vision blurring. "You didn't abandon me," I said quietly. "You loved me the only way you could, but it wasn't enough," she whispered. I didn't know how to answer that because part of me, some small, honest part, knew she was right. We sat in silence for a while. Then, almost hesitantly, she said, "He's still the same. You know, I didn't need to ask who. He doesn't talk about you," she continued. "But sometimes when he thinks I'm not looking, he stands in your old room." That caught me off guard. "He does," she nodded. "Just stands there like he's waiting for something he doesn't know how to ask for." I didn't know what to do with that image. My father, strong, unyielding, impossible, standing quietly in a room that no longer held me. Regret didn't fit the man I remembered. But time changes people, or at least it reveals what was always there underneath. My mother passed 3 days later. I was holding her hand when it happened. It wasn't dramatic. No last speeches, no sudden declarations, just a slow, quiet fatting. One breath, then another, then stillness. I sat there for a long time after holding her hand, even after it had gone cold. Daniel rested his hand on my shoulder. "She knew you were here," he said softly. I nodded. That mattered. It did. The funeral was held at the same church where I had once imagined weddings and holidays before everything had broken. Walking through those doors again felt like stepping into a memory that didn't quite belong to me anymore. People turned to look. Some faces I recognized, some I didn't. A few offered quiet condolences. Others just watched. Small towns remember. Even after 17 years, I stood beside Daniel and Lily at the front of the church, looking down at the closed casket. My mother had always loved simple things, fresh flowers, Sunday mornings, the sound of birds outside the kitchen window. I hoped she had found peace. I didn't see my father right away, but I felt him. That's the only way I can describe it. A presence, familiar, heavy. When I finally turned, he was standing near the back of the room. Older, yes, thinner, but still him. Our eyes met, and for a moment the years disappeared. I was 15 again, standing in that kitchen, waiting for him to decide whether I still belonged. He didn't come over right away. Neither did I. There are distances that aren't measured in steps. After the service, people gathered in small clusters, speaking in hushed voices. I stayed near the front, not trusting myself to move too far. Daniel stood beside me, steady as always. Lily held my hand. Then slowly I saw him walking toward me, each step deliberate, measured, like he had practiced this moment in his head and still didn't know how it would go. He stopped a few feet away, close enough that I could see the lines time had carved into his face, close enough to hear his breath. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then he gave a small, tight smile. Not warm, not kind, just familiar. And then he said it. So you finally learned your lesson. Time didn't stop, but something inside me did. All those years, all that distance. And that was what he chose to say. Not I'm sorry, not I missed you. Not even how have you been, just the same old judgment wrapped in the same old pride. I felt Daniel's hand lightly against my back, not pushing, not guiding, just there. I took a slow breath. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel small. Yeah, I said calmly. My voice didn't shake, didn't break. 17 years had changed that. Then I stepped slightly to the side. Then meet my husband. Daniel moved forward, offering his hand. Daniel Brooks, he said, calm, respectful, unshaken. My father looked at him. Then at me, then at Lily, and something in his expression cracked, not loudly, not dramatically, but unmistakably. He froze. My father did not take Daniel's hand, at least not at first. He just stared at it the way a man stares at something that doesn't fit the story he has been telling himself for years. Daniel, being Daniel, didn't let the moment turn ugly. He simply lowered his hand after a beat and gave a small nod as if to say, I'm here when you're ready. Lily stood beside me, quiet and watchful. She was 22 by then, old enough to read a room, old enough to understand that what had just happened was bigger than a rude remark at a funeral. My father's eyes moved to her. Is this? He began, then stopped. My daughter, I said. He looked at her for a long second, and I could almost see him doing the math in his head. 17 years. A child who should never have become a real person in his imagination. A life he had decided was ruined now standing in front of him in sensible black heels and a pearl clip in her hair, holding herself with more grace than he deserved. Lily offered a polite smile. Hello, sir. Not Grandpa, not yet. He swallowed hard. Well, he said, though the word came out thin, you seem to have done all right. I should have let it go. Maybe a gentler woman would have. But I had not come all this way to pretend history had been kind. I did more than all right, I said, without you. The words hung there between us. For once, he didn't snap back. Instead, he looked away toward the fellowship hall where casseroles and sheet cake waited for mourners who didn't know what else to do with grief. Then he said very quietly, There's coffee in the side room. It wasn't an apology, not even close. But it was the first thing he had ever said to me that wasn't an order or a condemnation. I turned to Daniel. Would you give me a minute? He studied my face, then nodded. We'll be right over there. Lily squeezed my hand before she went with him. Then it was just me and my father. He led the way into a small Sunday school room off the hallway. It still had the same folding chairs and faded Bible posters I remembered from childhood. The coffee urn sat on a metal cart already half empty. Through the wall, I could hear the low murmur of voices from the reception. Neither of us sat down. He poured himself coffee. He didn't drink. I stood by the window with my hands clasped so he wouldn't see them shaking. Finally, he said, You look like your mother. I let out a breath through my nose. That's the first nice thing you've said to me in 17 years. He flinched. It was small, barely there, but I saw it. Good, I thought. Let him feel something. He kept his eyes on the styrofoam cup in his hands. She talked about you. I know. She kept your school pictures in the dresser drawer. He paused. And the baby announcement you sent. That startled me. I had mailed that announcement after Lily was born, mostly for my mother's sake. A folded card with her name, weight, and a picture, Mrs. Jenkins had paid for at Sears Portrait Studio. I had never known whether it even made it into the house. I didn't think you'd kept it, I said. I didn't, he replied. Then after a beat, your mother did. There it was again. That old division, as if everything tender belonged to her and everything hard belonged to him. I turned from the window and faced him fully. Why did you say that to me out there? I asked. At her funeral after all this time, why would you say that? His jaw tightened. For a moment I thought he might retreat into anger the way he always had, but grief, age, and the sight of the life I had built must have done something to him because when he spoke again, his voice sounded tired. I don't know, he said. That's not good enough. He looked up, then really looked at me. No, he said. It isn't. I waited. He set the cup down on the cart with a shaky hand. I had a whole speech in my head. Driving here this morning, getting dressed, standing by that casket, I kept thinking I ought to say something decent. He gave a humorless laugh. Then I saw you, saw him, saw your daughter. And the first thing out of my mouth was the same ugly thing I would have said 20 years ago. 17. What? 17 years ago, I said. Not 20. He nodded once as if he deserved the correction. I stepped closer. Do you have any idea what you did to me? His face changed then. not defensiveness. Not quite, more like a man bracing for impact. You threw me out, I said. I was 15 years old. I was scared and sick and ashamed. And you threw me out like I was garbage on the curb. Do you know where I slept that first week? Do you know how many jobs I worked? How many times I had to choose between groceries and rent? How many nights I sat awake terrified my daughter would get sick because I couldn't afford a doctor? He opened his mouth, but I kept going. 17 years had earned me that. You didn't teach me a lesson, I said. You abandoned me. There's a difference. His eyes went wet, and that unnerved me more than if he had yelled. I know that now, he said. I stopped. It was such a simple sentence, quiet, unadorned, but it landed harder than anything else he could have said. He dragged a hand over his face and looked suddenly terribly old. At the time, I told myself I was doing the right thing, that if I was hard enough, maybe you'd understand the seriousness of what you'd done. I told myself the world wouldn't be gentle, so I shouldn't be either. He let out a long breath, but the truth. He looked down at the floor. I was humiliated. I was angry. I cared more about what people would say than what my daughter needed. I thought I was protecting the family name. His voice broke on the last word. All I did was break my family. I stared at him. In all the years I had imagined this conversation, I had pictured denial, excuses, maybe some version of you forced my hand. I had not pictured this. He sank into one of the folding chairs as if his legs had given out. Your mother never forgave me, he said. Not really. She stayed. We had our life, but there was a room in that house I could never walk past without hearing what I'd done. He rubbed at his eyes with the heel of his hand. Sometimes I stood in your doorway and tried to think of what I'd say if you ever came home. And every time I came up empty, I felt anger still hot and old and justified. But tangled up in it now was something else. Sorrow maybe for my mother, for the wasted years, for the stubbornness that costs people everything before they notice the bill. I wrote letters, I said softly. He looked up. What? I wrote letters I never sent. About Lily, about school, about my life. I swallowed. Part of me kept waiting for you to come find me, even after what you did. His face folded in on itself then, and the sound that came out of him was small and raw. I'm sorry, Emily. There it was, not polished, not public. Not too late to matter, though, too late to fix. I'm sorry, he said again. I was cruel, I was proud, and I was wrong. The room went quiet except for the old church radiator knocking in the corner. A soft tap came at the door, and Lily stepped in hesitant. Mom, everything okay? I looked at her. My daughter, my promise, kept the proof that ruin had never been the end of my story. Yes, I said, though my voice wavered. Come here. She came to stand beside me. My father rose slowly. Lily, he said, testing the name like something fragile. I don't expect anything from you, but I'd like to know you if you'd ever allow it. She glanced at me first. Smart girl. Then she said with more kindness than he had earned. Maybe we start with hello. His mouth trembled into the beginnings of a broken smile. Hello, Lily. And for the first time in 17 years, something in that room gave way. Not all at once, not completely, but enough for light to get in. The morning after the funeral, I woke in the guest room of the old house where I had grown up. For a few seconds, I didn't know where I was. The ceiling looked familiar in that distant, unsettling way old dreams do. The wallpaper in the hallway cream with tiny blue flowers had been changed sometime in the late 90s, but the floorboards still creaked in the same places. Even the heat kicked on with the same rattling groan I remembered from winter mornings before school. Daniel was still asleep beside me, one hand resting over the blanket between us, steady even in sleep. I lay there listening to the house. No raised voices, no tension pressing through the walls, just the hum of the refrigerator downstairs and the faint clink of a spoon against a mug. My father was awake. For a long moment, I thought about staying in bed until Daniel stirred, letting him go down with me, keeping a witness between myself and whatever came next. But some things I've learned have to be face standing on your own 2 feet. I slipped on my robe and went downstairs. My father was in the kitchen wearing an old flannel shirt and reading glasses low on his nose. A coffee mug sat in one hand. The morning paper lay folded beside him, though he didn't seem to be reading it. When he looked up and saw me, he stood too quickly like he wasn't sure whether he should. Morning, he said. It was such an ordinary word. That almost made me cry. Morning, I answered. There was a pause. Then he cleared his throat and gestured awkwardly toward the coffee pot. I made fresh. Thank you. He poured me a cup without asking how I took it. He still remembered. 2 sugars, a little cream. That small detail caught me off guard more than anything else had. I sat at the kitchen table where I had once heard my whole life change in a single sentence. Sunlight came in through the window above the sink. Dust floated in it, quiet and harmless. My father sat across from me, not at the head of the table. I noticed that too. For a while we said nothing. Then he spoke. I don't expect forgiveness because I apologized. His voice was rough but steady. I looked up. I know that I said. He nodded. Good, because I don't deserve that kind of shortcut. That sounded like something my mother would have said. I wondered if grief had finally taught him her language. He folded his hands and looked down at them. They were older hands now, still broad, still rough from years of factory work and fixing things around the house. But there was stiffness in them, tremor too, just a little. I spent a lot of years telling myself there'd be time, he said. Time to reach out, time to say the right thing, time to clean up a mess I made. He gave a bitter smile. Turns out time doesn't do much cleaning on its own. No, I said quietly. It doesn't. We sat with that. Then he stood and crossed to the counter. For a moment, I thought he was just escaping the conversation, but instead he came back carrying a worn tin box I recognized immediately. My mother's sewing box. Only this one was heavier. He set it in front of me carefully. She kept these, he said. I opened the lid. Inside were photographs, school papers, birthday cards, and little pieces of my life I had assumed were gone forever. A second-grade report card with a gold star on it. A ribbon from the county science fair. A snapshot of me at 13, grinning with braces and sunburned cheeks. Under those was the baby announcement I had mailed after Lily was born. Faded now, but still there. And beneath that, letters. My letters, not the ones I never sent. The birthday cards from my mother, the notes she had written, copies maybe, or ones she had never mailed. One envelope had my name on it in her soft, careful handwriting, but was still sealed. I looked up sharply. She wrote when she could, he said. Sometimes she mailed them. Sometimes she didn't. Sometimes she hid things away because she was tired of asking my permission for love. That one nearly took my breath away. I touched the unopened envelope with my fingertips. Read it later, he said. It's yours. My eyes filled. I don't know what to do with all this, I admitted. You don't have to do anything today. That too was new. The old him would have pushed for a resolution he could understand. The man sitting across from me now seemed to finally understand that healing moved at a human pace, not a proud man's schedule. A little later, Daniel came downstairs with Lily right behind him. She looked at the table at the box at my face and immediately understood this was no ordinary breakfast. Daniel poured himself coffee and gave my shoulder a gentle squeeze. Lily sat beside me and picked up the old baby announcement. That's me, she asked, smiling. I laughed softly through tears. That's you. She studied it for a moment, then looked over at my father, at her grandfather. He seemed almost afraid to meet her eyes, but Lily had always been braver than most. You can tell me about my grandma, she said, if you want. His face changed at that. Not relief exactly, more like gratitude mixed with disbelief. I'd like that, he said. So we sat there, 4 people around a kitchen table with more history than comfort, and began with small things. My mother's terrible habit of overwatering her ferns. The lemon pie she only made on Easter. The way she used to hum while folding laundry. Daniel asked a question now and then never too many. Lily listened hard as if she were collecting pieces of someone she had been denied. And I watched my father choose gentleness sentence by sentence. Not perfectly. Not fluently, but sincerely. By noon, it was time for us to leave. Daniel loaded our bags into the car while Lily hugged me and said she'd ride back with a friend from town later that afternoon after meeting an old college classmate nearby. She wanted a few more hours to look through the keepsakes with me, then changed her mind at the last minute and said, Actually, I think you two should have this goodbye on your own. Smart girl again. So it was just me and my father on the front porch. The day was cool and bright. A breeze stirred the trees at the curb. For one strange second, I saw a flash of the 15-year-old girl I had once been bag in hand, heartbroken, walking away from this house because she had no other choice. I'm not promising more than I have, I said. He nodded. I know. I can't pretend the past didn't happen. You shouldn't. I may get angry again. You have every right. I looked at him for a long moment. This man who had wounded me more deeply than anyone else and who now stood in the remains of his own pride with nothing to hide behind. I'm willing, I said slowly, to leave the door open, his eyes filled. Not with triumph, with humility. That's more than I deserve, he said. Maybe, I replied, but it's what I can live with. He gave one small nod. Thank you. I stepped off the porch, then turned back once more. 17 years ago, he had shut the door on me. Today, I chose not to slam it back, just to leave it open enough for something better to walk through. As Daniel and I drove away, I held my mother's tin box in my lap and looked out at the town growing smaller behind us. I didn't feel neat. I didn't feel finished. Life rarely gives us that kind of ending. What I felt was quieter. A little grief, a little peace, and the hard-earned understanding that sometimes the people who fail us most are the very ones who teach us what kind of love we will never withhold from others. If this story stirred something in your own heart, an old hurt, an unfinished conversation, a memory you've carried longer than you meant to, I hope you'll sit with it a while. Maybe share it with someone who needs it. And if stories like this speak to you, I'd be grateful if you stayed, listened again, and joined me for the next one. If this story gave you chills, smash that like button and tell us in the comments. What is the most satisfying moment of closure you have ever experienced? And of course, subscribe for more stories like this.